The wind howled outside the windows of the small suburban home, its icy fingers scraping against the glass like an unseen hand trying to break in. Inside, the warmth of a crackling fire did little to ease the tension in the room. It was Christmas Eve, a time usually filled with laughter, holiday cheer, and the comforts of family. But for Maya, tonight was different. This year's holiday season had already been difficult. A recent breakup, a strained relationship with her family, and financial struggles had left her feeling disconnected from the usual holiday joy. She had planned a quiet evening at home, hoping the loneliness wouldn't feel so sharp in the comfort of her own space. A simple dinner, a glass of wine, and perhaps a movie, nothing extravagant, nothing to invite more heartache. But then came the unexpected phone call. It was from an old friend, Jason. Maya hadn't heard from him in years, but his voice was familiar, and the warmth in it made her feel a flicker of hope. Jason had been a close friend in her college days, someone who always knew how to make her laugh, someone she could trust. So when he asked if he could stop by for a quick visit on Christmas Eve, she didn't hesitate. Just for an hour, he'd said, his voice light and easy. It'll be good to catch up. I'm in town visiting family. She had agreed, a small part of her feeling the urge for companionship, even if only for a short time. After all, it was Christmas, and it was nice to know someone cared enough to reach out. The doorbell rang a little after 8 p.m. Maya had just finished setting the table for her modest meal when she heard it. She stood from the dining table, smoothing out her shirt, trying to shake off the feelings of nervous anticipation that had built up ever since Jason's call. The feeling was strange, like something was off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Opening the door, she was greeted by Jason's smile. He looked exactly like she remembered, tall, with a scruffy beard, his eyes gleaming with that playful sparkle that had always made him the life of any room. There was something oddly familiar about him, but then, he was an old friend. Maybe that's all it was. Hey, Maya, Jason said, his voice warm but carrying a hint of something she couldn't quite place. Thanks for having me over. She smiled, though it felt forced. Of course. Come in, it's cold out there. He stepped inside, and Maya immediately noticed that something about him seemed different. Maybe it was the way his eyes lingered too long, or the unsettling smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She shrugged it off, trying to focus on the familiar comfort of the evening. It was just a visit, after all. Nothing more. As they moved into the living room, Jason settled onto the couch, looking around at her modestly decorated home. The holiday lights twinkled faintly in the background, and the tree in the corner was adorned with ornaments that had been passed down through generations. Yet, despite the holiday ambience, a coldness lingered in the air. Maya couldn't ignore the sense that something was wrong. You're doing well, huh? Jason asked casually, his eyes scanning the room. Maya hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Her life hadn't been easy lately, but there was something in Jason's tone that made her want to lie. She didn't want to admit that she felt lost, like her life was slowly falling apart around her. Instead, she nodded and forced a smile. Yeah, just trying to get by, she said, her voice soft. Jason didn't say anything for a moment, but his eyes never left her. The silence was deafening. It was then that Maya realized, there was something wrong. This wasn't the easy, comforting friendship she remembered. Jason wasn't the man she once knew. And there was no mistaking it now, the invitation she had extended was quickly turning into something much more dangerous than she had ever anticipated. Maya tried to push away the gnawing feeling that something was off. She had invited Jason here to escape the emptiness, not to let her imagination run wild. Maybe it was just the result of too much solitude, she told herself. But as they chatted about old times, Maya couldn't shake the unease that clung to her like a second skin. Jason's voice was smooth, but there was a coldness beneath the warmth that unsettled her. He asked questions that seemed oddly invasive, more probing than they needed to be. So, what's been keeping you busy these days? He asked, taking a sip of the wine she had poured him. Maya wasn't sure how to answer. She had been juggling a series of odd jobs and trying to make sense of her life. It was complicated, and it certainly wasn't a topic she wanted to dive into with someone she hadn't seen in so long. Just, life. Same old stuff, she replied, her voice too casual. Jason raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. You're not the type to just let life pass you by. What happened to that fire you used to have? His words stung more than she expected. That fire? It felt like a distant memory now. A life she had lost somewhere along the way, replaced by the grind of daily survival. But she wasn't about to admit that to him. I guess it's just been a rough few months, she said softly, staring into her glass. Jason's gaze was fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He didn't speak right away, and the silence stretched out between them, thick and uncomfortable. Maya's heart began to race. Something wasn't right. Are you sure that's all? Jason's voice dropped an octave, more insistent now. Maya blinked, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She could feel the pressure of his eyes on her, like he was studying her every move. A knot twisted in her stomach, and she found herself looking for an excuse to leave, to get away from the growing tension in the room. Yeah, she said quickly, forcing a smile. I'm fine. It's nothing to worry about. Jason leaned back, clearly not convinced. But he didn't push further. Instead, he took another sip of his wine and seemed to relax a little. For a brief moment, Maya thought that maybe everything was going to be okay. Maybe her nerves were just getting the better of her. But the feeling didn't fade. It only intensified. Do you still keep in touch with anyone from college? Jason asked after a long pause, his tone casual again. Maya shrugged, trying to shake off the tension that was building. A few people. But, life changes. People change. Jason's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at her, something she couldn't explain. People change, he repeated, almost to himself. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what he meant by that, but she was starting to feel like the walls were closing in. The laughter and easy conversation that had once defined their friendship felt distant now. She was no longer sure who she was talking to. A small part of her wanted to ask him to leave. But the larger part, the part that still wanted to believe in the man she used to know, kept her rooted to the spot. She had invited him here, she couldn't just ask him to leave without an explanation. But as the conversation continued, the unease settled deeper into her bones, until it felt like it was part of the very air she breathed. Hey, Maya, Jason said, suddenly breaking the silence. His voice was softer now, almost too calm. Do you remember the last time we saw each other? It was at that party, remember? The one where you left early. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She didn't like the direction the conversation was taking. The memories of that party were hazy, but there was one thing she knew for sure, she had left because something had felt wrong. Jason had been different that night too. Yeah, I remember, she said carefully, her voice wavering. Jason leaned in a little closer, his eyes darkening. You should have stayed. We could have had a lot of fun that night, Maya. If you had just trusted me. Maya's pulse quickened. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't. She was trapped, and the air felt heavier with every passing second. The knock at the door shattered the fragile calm that had settled over Maya. Her hand froze mid-air, clutching her glass of wine, as a chill swept through the room. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she had imagined it. But then came another knock, more urgent this time, and a shiver ran down her spine. Jason turned toward the door, his expression unreadable. Maya hesitated, unsure of what to do. She glanced at him, but his eyes were already fixed on the door, the same intensity from earlier now replaced by something darker. Who could that be? She asked, trying to sound casual. But the words came out strained. Jason didn't answer. Instead, he stood and walked slowly toward the door, as if the visitor were a mere inconvenience. Maya's heart raced in her chest, the unease from earlier swelling into a knot of dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to unfold. When Jason opened the door, the gust of cold air from the outside sent a shiver through Maya, even though the room was warm. The silhouette of a man stood in the doorway, framed by the soft light from the street lamp outside. "Maya," Jason said quietly, his voice low and full of something she couldn't quite place. Maya stood frozen, unsure if she should make herself known to this stranger at the door or if she should retreat to the safety of the kitchen. But her legs felt like lead, her body paralyzed by the tension in the room. The man at the door was tall, wearing a thick winter coat and a scarf that hid most of his face. His eyes, however, gleamed in the dim light, and there was something unsettling in the way he looked at her. His gaze lingered just a moment too long, as if he was sizing her up. "Can I help you?" Maya asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound calm. Jason didn't answer her. He simply stepped aside, letting the stranger into the house. The man's footsteps echoed as he entered, and Maya felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the cold air. "Just a friend of Jason's," the man said in a low, gravelly voice. "Don't mind me." Maya forced herself to nod, but her instincts were screaming at her to get out. She didn't know this man, and there was something about his presence that felt off. The man's eyes never left her as he walked past, and his gaze lingered just a little too long before he turned to face Jason. They exchanged a glance, and Maya noticed something flicker between them, an unspoken understanding, a quiet tension that was almost palpable. Jason closed the door behind the man, the sound of the latch clicking shut reverberating in the silence. Maya felt like she couldn't breathe. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely, and it felt as if the walls were closing in around her. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but Jason didn't seem to hear her. He turned toward the man, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Maya, this is Paul," he said, his voice colder than before. "Paul and I go way back." Paul offered her a curt nod, but he didn't smile. There was something predatory in his movements, something that sent an instinctual warning shot straight through her. Maya felt a deep sense of foreboding, but she couldn't pinpoint why. "Nice to meet you," she said, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. Jason took a seat at the table, gesturing for Paul to join him. The room was eerily quiet, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Maya glanced between the two men, feeling more and more like an outsider in her own home. The tension in the room seemed to grow thicker, pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. Something about Paul's presence, his stillness, his quiet intensity, made her skin crawl. But Jason acted like everything was perfectly normal, like the man who had just walked into her home wasn't an immediate threat. Maya's heart was pounding in her chest, but she forced herself to keep her voice steady. "What are you two doing here, really?" she asked, her words sharp now, as if to break the growing silence. Jason and Paul exchanged a brief look, and then Jason turned to her, his eyes cold and unreadable. "It's just business, Maya. Nothing to worry about." But Maya wasn't so sure. And as Paul stepped closer to the table, taking a seat across from her, she realized just how wrong everything felt. The conversation they were having seemed off, disjointed and filled with vague references. The more she tried to focus, the more disconnected it felt, as if they were speaking in code, leaving her on the outside, completely unaware of their real intentions. Maya tried to shake the uncomfortable feeling that was creeping up her spine. She took another sip of wine, but it did little to calm her nerves. The room felt colder, the shadows in the corners seemed to lengthen, and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen now felt eerily loud in the silence between them. Jason and Paul's conversation continued, though Maya could hardly make sense of it. They spoke in hushed tones, glancing at her occasionally, but it was clear they didn't want her to be part of the discussion. She could feel their eyes on her, though, as if they were waiting for something, or maybe even expecting something from her. Her heart pounded in her chest as her mind raced, searching for answers. Who was this man, Paul? And why was Jason acting so distant, so closed off? The warmth and familiarity she had felt with him earlier had disappeared, replaced by something far colder. Jason had always been a bit secretive, but this felt different. The way he refused to look at her, the way his voice lacked any warmth when he spoke, it all pointed to something wrong. Something serious. She stood up abruptly, the sudden movement making both men look up at her. "Excuse me," she said, trying to maintain her composure. "I need a moment." Neither of them responded. Jason simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and Paul's eyes followed her as she walked away. Maya could feel his gaze on her like a weight pressing down on her back, making it difficult to breathe. Maya moved quickly to the kitchen, her mind racing. She opened the refrigerator, grabbing another bottle of wine, but she didn't pour herself another glass. She needed to think, to process what was happening. Something about Paul's presence felt off, like he was a predator waiting to strike. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a grave mistake letting him into the house. But Jason had vouched for him, hadn't he? Jason had said he was a friend. But then why had Jason seemed so distant, so cold? The quiet murmur of their conversation reached her ears, but it only made her more paranoid. She turned back toward the living room, her heart pounding. Jason and Paul were still talking, but Maya could no longer ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut. Something wasn't right. The conversation had shifted now. She could hear Jason's voice growing more forceful, though she couldn't make out the words. There was an edge to his tone that hadn't been there before, and she felt her blood run cold. She stepped toward the doorway of the living room, peering through the crack in the door. The sight that greeted her made her freeze in place. Jason was standing, his posture tense, while Paul sat back in his chair, his hands folded calmly on the table. But there was a tension between them now, an underlying hostility that hadn't been there before. Maya's pulse quickened as she watched them. Paul's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was something more sinister, something that made Maya's stomach churn. "Jason," Paul said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "You know this is the right decision. You can't back out now." Jason's jaw clenched, but he didn't answer immediately. Maya could see the struggle in his eyes, the conflict that seemed to tear him apart. She had never seen him like this before. What was going on? Why wasn't he telling her what was happening? Maya has no idea, does she? Paul's voice was low, almost mocking. Maya stepped back from the doorway, her heart racing. She had to know what was happening. But as she turned to walk back to the living room, she found herself frozen. A strange sound, an odd scraping noise, came from behind her. She whipped around, expecting to see nothing, but instead found Paul standing right behind her. Maya stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't even heard him approach, and now, here he was, just inches away from her. "I didn't mean to startle you," Paul said with a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were cold, calculating, as if he was studying her every move. Jason stepped into the hallway, his face a mask of unreadable emotion. He said nothing, but Maya could feel the weight of his gaze on her. She glanced between them, trying to read the situation, but nothing made sense. "Are you okay?" Jason asked, his voice low. "Just, sit down. We need to talk." Maya's heart skipped a beat. Something about the way he said it made her blood run cold. His words didn't offer comfort. They only filled her with a sense of dread. She nodded, too stunned to speak, and slowly made her way back to the table. Paul followed her, his eyes never leaving her. Maya didn't dare look back at him as she sat down. She couldn't understand why Jason was acting this way. Why was Paul here? Why was he acting so strange? Her mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last.